Welcome back to Alien Love Stories. Let me ask you something strange tonight. Just one little bite of absurdity to stir your curiosity. What would you do if your best friend offered to cook you dinner and then casually mentioned he'd be using a dying star as an ingredient? I didn't run. I said, sure, as long as it's vegetarian. That was mistake number one. Mistake number two? I didn't ask what gravitational field pairs best with garlic. But I'll get to that. Let me tell you about Kawari. He's, not from here. Celian 5, specifically. That's a planet where food is considered sacred, not in a grandma's chicken soup cures heartbreak way, but in a literal way. Flavor is currency, taste is power, and chefs are both priests and weapons engineers. Kari isn't just a cook. He's a culinary alchemist, and somehow also my best friend. We met 2 years ago when I got drunk and accidentally bit on a wormhole knife on a black market space auction site. It arrived in a box marked perishable. Kari was inside sipping soup. He never left. Since then, he's lived on my couch, insulted every spice rack on earth, and taught me that mushrooms scream if you cut them wrong, at least the ones that think. Anyway, last week Kari offered to cook, like really cook. He stood in my kitchen wearing an apron that read, "Kiss the Cosmic Chef" in 14 languages and said, "You've been sad. Let me fix it." I blinked. "With dinner?" "With gravity," he replied. I wasn't sure if that was a metaphor or a threat. He pulled out his portable singularity chamber, a glowing orb the size of a grapefruit, swirling with light, sound, and possibly the condensed remains of a long-dead star. He placed it gently on the counter. "I'm making pasta," he said. "You always make pasta. This time it'll have density." He explained the recipe like it was poetry. Gravitoni pasta, freshly spun using interwoven temporal strands, boiled in the magnetic heartbeat of a collapsing star, and seasoned with velocity shavings. I stared, then asked, "You're gonna cook noodles in a dying star?" He nodded, humming softly as he began prepping. I tried to watch TV, couldn't concentrate. The air in the apartment began to feel heavy, like a weighted blanket wrapped around my thoughts. Kari moved with ease, floating between steps like the kitchen had forgotten about friction. Bowls didn't clink, they resonated. Water didn't boil, it whispered. By the time he added the pasta, thin, translucent ribbons that shimmered like auroras, the lights in the apartment had dimmed, without touching the switch. I approached the counter. "What is that smell?" "Truth," he said. "What?" "Also garlic." He grinned. His eyes flickered with tiny constellations, something that only happens when he's completely focused or dangerously excited. I asked, "Is this safe?" "Define safe." "Won't kill me." Number might stretch your definition of reality a little. I stared at the pot. Tiny whirlwinds danced across the surface. One of them winked at me. Kari ladled the pasta onto 2 plates. The noodles coiled like sleeping galaxies. He handed me a fork. "Eat while it's still warm. You want the gravity soft." That sentence didn't make sense, but I obeyed. First bite, warm, sweet, infinite. I tasted childhood, heartbreak, stars collapsing in beauty, the exact sound of someone saying, "I missed you," without using words. And then, thunk. My spoon floated, then fell, then floated again. Kari sat down, chewing calmly. My plate slid half an inch toward the center of the table. I reached for my water. The glass spun gently. "Kari," I said. "What's happening?" He looked up, pleased. "Local gravity field distortion means it's working." "What's working?" He gestured. "The recipe." Then he paused, tilted his head. "They're also the table." "What about the table?" "It may now have a gravitational core." "You're saying my dinner table has its own gravity?" He nodded. "Technically, it's now a minor attractor." My napkin lifted slightly from my lap. I grabbed it. The salt shaker slid toward Kari. He caught it with one hand. "Relax," he said. "It's only a 0.6 on the Klein-Pull rating. You won't collapse into a noodle singularity unless you cry too hard during dessert." I blinked. "Is that a real scale?" "I invented it." Okay. We sat in silence. Around us, cutlery spun. Crumbs orbited. Even the steam rose in tight spirals. I'm not freaking out, I said aloud. You're glowing, Kari noted. No, I looked at my hand. Faint shimmer. Pale golden light. Side effect, he said. Emotional resonance binding to the dish. You're saying this pasta is emotionally reactive? Only if you lie. I set down my fork. Are you trying to tell me something? Kari looked at me and didn't blink. I'm feeding you the truth, he said. It was time. My stomach dropped. Not from fear, from gravity, real gravity. The table trembled slightly. We both leaned forward unintentionally, drawn in. Kari! Don't resist it, he said gently. Just feel what the food is telling you. I wanted to ask what that meant, but then I took another bite and remembered something. A night, a rooftop. Kari beside me, almost kissing me, but pulling away at the last second. I'd forgotten it, until now. The pasta had pulled it out, wrapped it in flavor, brought it back like a long-lost satellite finally caught in orbit. Kari was watching me, silent, waiting. And the table beneath us began to hum, softly, like a low gravitational purr. Let me start by saying something I think we can all agree on. Dinner shouldn't generate a measurable gravitational field. Pasta, in particular, is not supposed to bend light. And yet, that's exactly what mine was doing. I sat at the edge of my own dinner table, gripping the chair like I was on the edge of a cliff, or maybe on the event horizon of something deeper, hungrier. Across from me, Kari just kept chewing, smiling, like it was the most normal thing in the universe for a noodle to vibrate in slow motion and hum in a minor key. I stared at my plate. The pasta wasn't still. It moved. It didn't squirm like something alive. That would have been less disturbing. It rotated. It spun in on itself, slowly collapsing and unfolding like it was trapped in an eternal spiral. Tiny flecks of stardust embedded in the noodles glittered in soft rhythm with my heartbeat. At least, I think it was my heartbeat. The table was humming too. Low, deep, not loud, but felt, like the pressure in your ears before a storm. My fork was hovering about an inch off the surface, spinning like a lazy satellite. A grain of Parmesan floated by. Kari caught it mid-air and popped it into his mouth. Perfect, he whispered. This is exactly the flavor I was hoping for. I blinked. The flavor of collapsing matter, he smiled. Number of emotional honesty trapped in starch. I blinked again, this time harder. Kari, there's a swirl forming over the salt shaker. He nodded. The gravitational turbulence is probably reaching equilibrium. Equilibrium? My pepper grinder just rolled uphill. Temporal wobble, he said calmly. Totally expected. At this point, I felt it. The shift, not just around me, in me. Something in my chest tugged, not painfully, just insistently, like a magnetic pull behind the ribcage. I stood up, or tried to. The chair didn't want me to go. The table didn't want me to go. My body stayed seated even while my intentions reached for the door. Kari's eyes met mine. You're feeling it now, he said. What exactly am I feeling? Gravitic sympathy. Gravi, what? He leaned in. The table's field is locking into your emotional mass, your memories, your density of meaning. I stared blankly. He tried again. It's connecting to the part of you that's heavy. I swallowed. Kari, why would you cook that? Why feed me something that turns dinner into an existential therapy vortex? He looked down at his plate, quiet, then said, because I needed you to stop avoiding things. I'm not avoiding anything. My left arm lit up. Golden shimmer, just below the shoulder. I stared. That's new. He said nothing. I continued. This is part of the food, right? A reaction? A visual metaphor? He gave a half nod. It's the pasta, but it's you too. I scoffed. I'm perfectly fine, Kari. Just dealing with work stress, normal human stress. You know, deadlines, rent, meaningless existence, the usual. My face glowed. A burst of light bloomed across my jawline like an aurora trying to escape. Kari sipped his wine. which, by the way, was blue and humming. "I thought so," he said softly. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small device, a tiny cube of mirrored surfaces, rotating silently. He placed it gently on the table. The table accepted it, swallowed it, not physically. It was like the object fell into the concept of the table, like the gravity itself folded over and tucked it away. "What was that?" I asked. He leaned forward. "The anchor." "For what?" "You." The next 10 minutes were a blur of weird physics and weirder feelings. The table began projecting low-level spatial distortions. Condensation formed in reverse on my glass, beating inwards. The leftover noodles began clumping, not because they were drying out, but because they were collapsing toward themselves, tiny spirals forming inside larger spirals. Kari explained it like this. "The pasta's gravity isn't physical, it's emotional, but emotion has mass here. I cooked that into the strands." He pointed at the plate. "Each noodle represents a memory." I squinted. "You mean metaphorically?" "No." I picked up one shimmering strand. It vibrated gently in my hand. I brought it closer to my face, and I remembered something I hadn't thought about in years. The way Kari had looked at me that night after the car broke down, when we slept under the stars and he asked me, "If I wasn't from here, would you still trust me?" I never answered. And now, holding that strand of pasta, I knew the answer. I'd always known. Kari stood, walked around the table, stood beside me. "You remember it now," he said. "I do." "And?" "I don't know." The table responded with a subtle pulse, like a heartbeat. I dropped the noodle. He caught it midair, gently coiled it back onto the plate. "You've been drifting," he said, "ever since we met." "I'm allowed to drift." "I know, but I want you to feel what it's like to be pulled back." I stood. He stepped closer. "Kari, this is a really complicated way to have a conversation." He smiled. "Salient 5 doesn't have therapy. We have dinner." The gravity deepened. My plate was now warping the wood underneath. Time felt slower. Breath felt thicker. Every word I said required more effort, more honesty. I hated it, and I loved it, because I could finally feel myself existing again. Kari took my hand. "Tell me something real," he said. "I'm scared." He nodded. "What else?" "I don't know how to stop pretending." The table pulsed. "Keep going," he whispered. "I miss when we used to talk at 2 a.m. for no reason." The shimmer returned. "My chest hurts when I think about losing you." Another pulse. I took a deep breath. I think I might have been in love with you this whole time." Silence. Kari didn't glow, didn't pulse. He just smiled and said, "I know." The table shifted, not violently, but like it was relieved. The tension in the air dissolved. The gravity remained, but now it felt warm, like belonging. Kari stepped back to his seat. Saturday gestured to the pasta. "Ready for dessert?" I blinked. "There's dessert." He grinned. "It's a souffle, infused with vulnerability." I laughed, the first real laugh in weeks, and the gravity held it close, didn't let it go. You know that moment when you realize everything's about to change? Not because of some dramatic revelation or a thunderclap of clarity, but because your fork just made 3 full rotations around your dinner plate without touching the surface? Yeah, that was me. At exactly 7:36 p.m. on a Wednesday, I watched my dinnerware achieve stable orbital velocity. And with it, so did something else. Every emotion I'd spent years avoiding. Let me explain. The pasta was gone, mostly. Kari had eaten his calmly, as if it hadn't broken the laws of physics or cracked open the fault lines of my repressed feelings. I'd eaten mine like a reluctant explorer tiptoeing into a temple that whispered truths instead of curses. And now everything in the room was being slowly sucked into a quiet, delicate orbit around the center of the table. Kari had leaned back in his chair, arms folded, eyes closed, humming something melodic and untranslatable. The pasta was finished, but the gravity remained. The salt shaker drifted past my elbow, wobbling like a toddler on its first swim lesson. My fork, glowing slightly from residual flavor resonance, spun lazily around the rim of my empty plate. I tried to reach for it. Missed. Tried again. Missed again. It dodged me with a precision that was either poetic or petty. Kari cracked one eye open and smirked. The utensil knows when you're not ready. I'm not fighting a fork right now. It's not fighting, he said, stretching. It's alignment. I glared at the fork like it had insulted my childhood. Alignment with what? The table? The meal? The emotional wreckage you just activated inside me? Kari stood, and in one fluid motion, caught the fork mid-orbit. He placed it gently on the table. Immediately, it sank half an inch into the wood. We both stared. I cleared my throat. So, I guess the gravity's getting stronger. Not stronger, Kari said softly. Just more honest. I didn't like the sound of that, but I didn't have time to argue because my chair suddenly leaned forward of its own volition. Not tipped, leaned, as if the table had decided it wanted me closer. I caught myself on the edge just before face planting into the plate. Kari, he raised his hands. I told you, don't fight it. I'm not fighting, I'm being absorbed. You're not being absorbed, you're being invited. I don't like the invitation. Then decline with dignity. The table pulsed. My chair spun in a slow circle, and something in my chest cracked open. Not physically, but spiritually. I felt it. A tiny, swirling storm of unfinished thoughts and unreleased words I hadn't said in years. The feelings I'd folded up neatly and stored away like expired coupons. Regret. Longing. The memory of Kari brushing my hand once during movie night, and me laughing it off like it didn't mean something. The smell of his hair after rain. The quiet way he cleaned up after himself but left me notes made of fruit peels and telepathic ink. Kari, I said again, this time softer. I think the table is pulling me into my own head. He nodded. That's the final phase. Phase? There are phases. Of course. You thought pasta from a dying star didn't come with emotional phases? I opened my mouth to respond, but didn't, because just then, the room tilted, not in the physical sense, but the light did. Time slowed, sound warped, and every object that had ever touched that table, spoons, candles, empty wine glasses, that one crossword puzzle I'd abandoned halfway, began to rise. Kari stepped back. This is it, he whispered. What is? He smiled. The part where the table shows you your orbit. My what? Where you revolve. Who you revolve around. What you keep circling but never land on. Suddenly the table flashed, a pulse of golden memory. And then I saw myself, not physically, but emotionally, orbiting Kari. Moments played out in slow-motion holograms. The time I caught him watching me sleep and pretended I didn't notice. The time he almost told me something, but choked on it and asked if I wanted more soup. The time he looked away too fast when I smiled. I felt it all, at once. 1,000 unspoken words condensed into one undeniable truth. I loved him. Not in the safe, platonic, thanks for feeding me other-worldly pasta kind of way, but in the terrifying, planetary, center of my personal universe kind of way. And the table knew. It spun me slowly in my chair, lifted my feet from the floor, lowered the lights into candlelight shadows. I hovered, weightless, raw, exposed. Kari stepped toward me, reaching, not to hold me, but to steady the space between us. I didn't cook for your taste buds, he said. I cooked for your silence. My heart thudded. He touched the back of my neck, and I glowed. Not metaphorically, actually. A soft golden light radiating from my skin like truth made visible. I can't unfeel this anymore, I whispered. He leaned in and said, You never did. And then the table sighed. A ripple passed through the room, like a held breath finally exhaled, and all at once gravity returned. Not crushing, not painful, just real. I landed softly in my chair. The fork rested gently against the plate. The salt shaker fell into its usual place. Kari sat down across from me again, poured more wine. I didn't glow anymore. I didn't need to. I'd said the thing, and gravity had heard. If you've never had your own memory escape your head, wrap around a fork, and spiral into a gravity well created by dinner, consider yourself lucky. or unawakened. Because it turns out memory has mass. It has orbit. And when someone like Kari, an alien chef from Celian 5, cooks your unresolved feelings into space-folded noodles, you don't just eat your past. It eats back. I found this out roughly 8 minutes after I said the words. I think I've been in love with you this whole time. And then, like a button had been pressed on the edge of reality, the table reacted. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't light. It was pull. A low, deep invitation in the bones of the world. And suddenly, things I hadn't thought of in years began to shimmer in the room like projections made of breath. The first one floated just above the salt shaker. It was me, sitting on the roof of the old apartment, barefoot, listening to Kari talk about how he didn't dream the way humans do. About how his species stored emotion in their skin until they fermented into memory. He touched my wrist and said, "You ferment too fast." Back then I laughed it off. Now I watch myself blink and look away, and I ached. The next memory came from beneath the pasta bowl. Kari and I dancing in the kitchen to a jazz record. It had skipped twice and we just went with it. He spun me. I spun him. He almost kissed me. I let it pass. Now I watched it loop, again, and again, and again. Like the table was saying, "This is the moment you drifted instead of landed." I reached out, trying to swipe it away, but my hand passed through. Not because it wasn't real, but because I wasn't allowed to stop it anymore. The table, the pasta, the dying star recipe. It had created a gravitational field strong enough to attract truths I hadn't admitted even to myself. Kari was silent, watching, respectfully distant. And then I saw a memory I didn't recognize. It floated above his glass. Him, alone, on my couch, holding the back of his neck, staring at a note I'd written but never sent. It said, "If you weren't from another world, I think I'd have already ruined this." He folded it, placed it in his jacket. I had never seen that moment, but the table had. It remembered for us. I stood. The air thickened. My feet left the ground again. Not from lightness, but from the sheer weight of understanding. Every emotional hesitation, every tiny redirection, every ha-ha, never mind, I had used like a shield, was now orbiting me. And Kari? He was calm, like he had expected this, maybe even built this gravity field for this. "I didn't know you read that note," I said quietly. He tilted his head. "You left it under my breakfast plate. Wasn't much of a hiding place. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you looked terrified." I exhaled. It wasn't that I didn't want this. "I know," he said. "You just didn't believe you were allowed." The table pulsed. Something behind me tugged gently at my spine, like nostalgia trying to hold my attention. I turned. Another memory. The day Kari moved in. Him standing in the doorway, holding nothing but a spherical suitcase in a carton of something that might have been milk or liquid philosophy. He smiled so wide back then, and I'd smiled too, but held the door like I wasn't sure if I'd close it again. Now I knew. I never had. Kari walked toward me. The orbit tightened. We stood within a pocket of time that didn't match the rest of the apartment. Outside, cars passed. Normal. Inside, the clock on the wall ticked backward. Kari reached into his jacket, pulled out the note, the one I'd forgotten. He held it out. "I've carried this across 6 versions of us." I took it, opened it. This time the handwriting glowed faintly, ink soaked with emotional radiation from the table's gravity field. It read, "If you weren't from another world, I think I'd have already ruined this. But you are, and somehow that makes it safe to feel this." I looked up. Kari nodded. "I knew you meant it," he said. "I still do." The moment hung. We didn't kiss. Not yet. We just held each other's eyes. Because for once, we didn't need to escape the gravity. We were the gravity. Then the pasta bowl cracked. A fine fracture across the surface. Not violent, just old energy shifting. Kari gasped. "The memory core's collapsing." "What does that mean?" "It means the truth is about to become irreversible." "I thought we already did that." "Not yet." He ran back to the table, reached into the bowl, pulled out the final strand. It shimmered blue-green, a color I'd never seen before, but instantly knew meant unspoken last chances. He handed it to me. Eat it. Kari, if you want to know what I never told you, eat it. I hesitated, then bit. The flavor was soft, salted with hope, laced with grief. And then I saw it. Kari, alone, sitting in a memory I'd never shared with him. My childhood, my fears, my guilt. He'd felt it all through the food, and had loved me anyway. Tears rose. He caught one on his fingertip. I always wanted to tell you, he said, but I was waiting for your gravity to notice mine. And just like that, I fell. Not through space, not from my chair, but into him and into us. Gravity doesn't usually make noise, at least not in the traditional sense. But when my dining table, a perfectly normal IKEA knockoff that I once spilled ramen on during a Game of Thrones binge, began to hum in a tone that vibrated my bones, I knew something was very wrong, or very right. Hard to say when the air itself is beginning to swirl with the weight of unspoken emotions, and your best friend/alien chef just handed you a noodle infused with his entire heart. Let me rewind 30 seconds. I ate the final strand of the gravitoni pasta, a noodle cooked in the outer halo of a dying star, a strand folded 13 times through quantum frequency matrices. A bite seasoned not with salt, but with Kari's feelings, marinated for years in silence and waiting. And that's when everything broke open. The bowl shattered first, not with shards, but with concepts. It didn't fall apart. It divided. Emotionally, fragments of the ceramic hovered in the air, each one glowing with a single word: regret, longing, almost, too late. But the last one didn't break. It hovered, solid, radiating. Now! And that's when the table beneath it began to bend. Not physically, not at first, narratively. The table began to curve like it had swallowed the climax of 100 unresolved romantic arcs and could no longer pretend to be furniture. I backed away. Kari stayed perfectly still. I've only seen this once before, he said softly. What is this? A singularity. A what? An emotional singularity. A core of truth so dense it bends not just time or space, but meaning. I blinked. Like a black hole for feelings? Yes. Do we survive this? He shrugged. Depends if we resist. The plates levitated, the walls shimmered. A picture frame on the far wall melted into a memory. Kari and I laughing on a couch that no longer existed, watching an alien cooking show he said was too realistic. The pasta had done this, or maybe we had, and the pasta had simply pulled back the curtain. The table creaked. Wood warped. The center began to sink inward, not collapsing, but folding, like it was trying to remember itself in a better timeline. Kari stepped forward. The light caught in his eyes, reflecting not just brightness, but everything I'd never dared to say aloud. You have to sit with it, he said. With what? Everything. I hesitated, then walked to the table. The pull was stronger now, not just physical, emotional. It drew my shoulders down, my breath inward, my heart out, and I sat. The chair groaned beneath me like it, too, had secrets. And then, the singularity opened. It didn't explode. It unfolded, like a napkin too sacred to use. Inside it, I saw myself. Every version. The one who wanted Kayari but feared losing him. The one who joked too much to hide sincerity. The one who stared at text drafts at 3 a.m. and deleted every "I miss you." The one who once called him just my roommate in front of someone who didn't matter. And all of them sat at this same table. All of them glowing, all of them silent. Until one, me, now, finally whispered, I'm tired of pretending I didn't feel it. And that's when the table cracked. This time really cracked. Right down the middle. Not out of destruction, out of release. And inside it, in the split, was a light. Warm, blue, alive. Kari reached into it, pulled out a spoon, made of memory. He handed it to me. Use it, he said. For what? For dessert. At that exact moment, the apartment door slammed open, literally off its hinges. 3 figures stood in the entry. One was tall, cloaked, glowing faintly. The second hovered, translucent, humming in minor chords. The third was my landlord. What the? He didn't get to finish, because the gravity caught him, lifted him gently off the floor. His briefcase floated open, revealing 3 unpaid invoices, a tennis ball, and a small note labeled, "Don't cry today." The cloaked figure stepped forward. Kari stiffened. I stood. "Who are they?" I asked. "The Council of Culinary Containment," he replied. "They regulate cross-emotional cooking violations." "Are we violating something?" "They're here because of the singularity." I looked at the table, now glowing with slow, rotating rings of stardust and spoonfuls of my entire emotional history. "Okay," I said. "That's fair." The lead figure stepped forward. Its voice came from inside my head. "You've created an unsanctioned emotional orbit, an intimacy vortex without license." "Sorry," I said. "We were just processing." "You cooked vulnerability without permission." Kari raised a hand. "I accept responsibility." The figure turned. "You cooked for him." Kari nodded. "Yes." "Then the singularity belongs to both of you." I swallowed. "So, what does that mean?" The figure stepped aside. A new chair materialized beside the table, wrought from memory and honesty and a slightly scorched cinnamon roll. "You sit together, or the orbit collapses." Kari looked at me, not as an alien, not as a roommate, but as the one who had always been pulling me in. I nodded. We sat. The table pulsed once and stabilized. The singularity folded gently into the wood. No longer a wound, now a center. And just like that, the gravity became ours. My landlord slowly descended back to the floor. He blinked, held up the tennis ball, said nothing. Left. Later that night, Kari brought out dessert, a souffle, of course, but it glowed in phases, each bite calibrated to a specific regret. We ate in silence. Every spoonful lightened the air, until finally I said, "So this is what it feels like when you stop resisting." Kari smiled. "No," he said. "This is what it feels like when you let gravity love you back." There's a moment, right after dessert, just before you admit something that could change everything, where time doesn't quite freeze, but it starts to lean. That's how it felt. Like the apartment, the gravity field stabilized table, and the last 24 hours of emotional revelation were all tipping forward, waiting for someone to push. Kari pushed, with a recipe. He didn't say, "I love you." He didn't say, "I've always felt this way." He just walked over to the counter, grabbed a notebook bound in woven star fibers, and placed it on the table like it might explode. "Is that your journal?" I asked. He shook his head. "It's a menu." "For what?" "For you." I blinked. "You've been writing recipes for me?" "For us." Then he opened it. The first page shimmered. Course 1, soup of hesitation, infused with pauses, cooked at the low simmer of friendship, stirred exactly 29 times over 2 years. He flipped to the next page. Course 2, pasta of proximity, hand-spun with hope, folded during quiet movie nights, boiled in suppressed feelings, served too late, by design. My stomach fluttered. Kari didn't look at me as he turned the page again. Course 3, dessert of possibility. Only bakes when 2 orbiting forces finally touch. I closed the notebook. "Kayari, what is this?" He finally looked at me, not like a friend, not like a chef, but like someone who'd built an entire language and flavor because words had never felt safe enough. "It's how I tell you," he said. "How you tell me what?" "That I've been cooking you into my future since the day we met." I exhaled, quietly, but the table heard it. It shimmered faintly, its new gravity flexing like a cat stretching after a nap. Kari sat down, folded his hands. "I was raised in a culture where food is confession," he said. "Words aren't sacred to us. Flavor is." "I know," I said softly. "You've told me that before?" He nodded. "But you never understood it until now." He was right. I hadn't. I'd always assumed Kari's elaborate dishes were just cultural habits. But now I realized They were letters. And every time I'd eaten his food, I'd been reading him without knowing. I reached across the table, took his hand. "So what's the next course?" I asked. He smiled and said something that, at the time, made no sense at all. "It's not a dish. It's a decision." Before I could ask, the table vibrated. A deep, resonant thrum, like a whale song made of nostalgia and electricity. I looked down. The table surface had begun displaying symbols, slowly swirling, glowing slightly. "Kari." He stood up, walked around to my side. "That's the final phase," he said. "Of what?" "Of gravitational synthesis. That's not a real thing." "It is now," he said, smiling with too much knowing. Then he placed something on the table. A box, black, chrome-lined, humming softly. "Every Celione chef who reaches emotional convergence must face it," he said. "Face what?" "The final kitchen." I stared. "Like a metaphor?" "Number A, literal kitchen. In here." He tapped the box. "It reads your gravity, your story, your memories. And then it creates a culinary environment inside it where you can either choose the dish that seals the bond, or burn it." I paused. "What happens if I burn it?" Kari didn't answer, which was an answer. He opened the box. Inside was not a kitchen. It was everything. Space folded inside. Smells, heat, sound, a flash of every meal we'd ever shared. Then a voice, not Kari's, spoke from the box. Software, neutral. "You may now cook your answer." Kari stepped back. "This is yours," he said. "I've already said what I needed to say." I looked into the box and was pulled in, not physically, just enough to see what I had to feel. The box created kitchen stations from my memories. There was the rooftop grill from the first time we watched a meteor shower together, the stovetop Kari used when he made breakfast the morning after I had a breakdown. Even the microwave we used when we both couldn't talk after an almost kiss that went nowhere. The box was saying, "Make something that tells the truth." I swallowed, then began. I picked 3 ingredients. Basil from the pot Kari kept on the balcony, even when it snowed. The last noodle I hadn't eaten earlier. Still soft, still resonant. A drop of wine from the glass I never touched that night. I should have said more. And I cooked, awkwardly, with feeling, without perfection, but with truth. I plated it, placed it in the center of the box, and said, "Serve." The kitchen vanished, the table returned. Kari stood still. The box closed, clicked once, then opened again. Inside a dish, not the one I'd made. A new one. It shimmered, radiated, twisted with motion and stillness at the same time. "What is it?" I asked. Kari leaned in, smiled. "That's us." Then he picked up a spoon, fed me the first bite. I didn't taste garlic, or salt, or spice. I tasted the absence of fear, the presence of something safe, and the memory of a kiss that hadn't happened yet, but would. Soon, the table pulsed again. Its gravity adjusted. The room stopped spinning. Because there was no need for orbit anymore. We weren't circling each other. We were home. There's something sacred about a first kiss that happens under artificial gravity, emotional resonance, and the scent of interstellar basil. And by sacred, I mean, we kissed, and then we floated into the ceiling, literally. But let me rewind a minute. Kari fed me the first bite of the dish the gravity table had conjured. The one born from my cooking, his emotion, and the singularity we accidentally stirred into my dining room. The taste? It didn't just bloom on my tongue. It unlocked something, a sound, a memory, a force that didn't belong to either of us alone, but now radiated between us like the core of a small, newly born star. We looked at each other, and then we kissed. I know, on Earth, that kind of sentence would be followed by a musical swell, perhaps a camera spin, a long sigh of fulfillment. But our kiss? Our kiss triggered the ceiling sensors. Apparently, my table's gravitational field had been growing steadily stronger since scene 2, and the apartment's internal balance compensators, which Kari installed without my permission, interpreted that emotional climax as a pressure spike, which in Celion 5 home tech means activate vertical decompression. Translation: the gravity shifted directions for precisely 4.8 seconds. We floated. Our feet left the ground. Our hearts already had. I felt the kiss pull me upward. Not away from him, but with him, like the entire universe agreed we needed a little less weight. Kari's hand stayed steady on my waist. Mine tangled somewhere between his shoulders and the stars mapped along the back of his neck. We hovered just below the ceiling fan, spinning slowly like two astronauts finally finding the right orbit. And I laughed. Because how else do you respond to gravity realigning itself just so you can kiss someone better? Was that supposed to happen? I asked between breaths. Kari, now upside down relative to the kitchen floor, smiled sheepishly. I might have forgotten to deactivate the love thrust protocol. Love what now? Salioni tradition. When two bonded gravities merge, the home adjusts to their shared resonance. You're telling me this was your house kissing us back? He blinked. It's possible. I tried to speak but giggled instead, which was apparently the emotional keyword that caused the lights to dim into romantic candle flicker mode. Kari blinked again. Okay, that part I definitely didn't program. We floated gently downward, the gravity easing back into place like a very apologetic seatbelt. Our feet touched the floor just as a soft ding rang out from the table. Kari? He turned. The table was glowing again. Not possible, he said. Explain? It shouldn't react twice, but it was reacting, vibrating gently like a cat purring through the memory of affection. The center opened. A slot appeared. Inside it, a single note. Kari picked it up, read it, froze. I stepped closer. What does it say? He handed it to me. The paper shimmered faintly, written in earth ink but Salioni syntax. Translated, it read, Congratulations. Your union has reached stable gravitational synthesis. Please report to the Registry of Entangled Partnerships for final attunement. Note, shared dreams may commence within the next 48 hours. Side effects include emotional synchronicity and shared cravings. Thank you for cooking with your heart. I blinked. Kari was already pulling out his communicator. Wait, I said. Is this like a wedding? He paused. Sort of. Sort of? On Celion 5, when two beings achieve synchronous gravitational cooking, it's considered permanent. I sat down. Hard. Are you saying that because we kissed over a noodle singularity and made a plate of metaphysical honesty, we're now married? Kari rubbed the back of his neck. Technically, I covered my face, then peeked through my fingers. How binding is technically? He grinned. You'd have to cook with someone else to undo it. I stared. Oh no, I've been emotionally trapped by carbs. Kari knelt beside me. Do you want out? I looked into his eyes, felt the pull. Not just the gravity, not just the memory, the truth. The way he looked at me like I was worth the wait. And the cooking. And the singularity. No, I whispered. He kissed me again. The apartment sighed around us, literally. The walls expanded 2.3% to accommodate what the building AI now classified as a domestic gravitational partnership. A message blinked on the wall panel. Congratulations! You are now registered as a quantum-bonded culinary union. Please enjoy 15% off all Space Spice subscriptions. Kari tapped a few buttons. Immediately, a small package appeared in the delivery tube. Truffle oil from the moons of Velith, he said, holding it up proudly. I took it, and then the doorbell rang. We both paused, looked at each other, slowly approached the door. I opened it. There stood an old woman in a lavender spacesuit, holding a clipboard and a floating measuring spoon. She didn't smile, didn't blink. Just said, I'm here to inspect the gravity field and taste your love. I opened the door, and there she stood, 4'11" maybe, lavender spacesuit, fully zipped up except for a small flap that revealed a golden badge shaped like a spoon caught in mid-stir. She was holding a clipboard, the kind that means business, the kind that usually ruins your day. And floating beside her, because apparently that's a thing now, was a spoon, not resting, not dangling, just hovering, gently vibrating like it had secrets to tell. She stared at me for 3 full seconds, then said, I'm here to inspect the gravity field and taste your love. Not a smile, not a blink. Just that. I blinked for both of us. Kari appeared behind me, still adjusting his tunic that had somehow unbuttoned itself during our emotionally weightless orbital kiss. "Registry enforcement?" he asked. The woman gave him a quick nod. "Section 7B, Emotional Synthesis Events, Unregulated Kitchens." Kari groaned under his breath. "Of course!" I raised a hand. "Sorry, who are you?" She flipped open the clipboard. "Inspector Vell, Galactic Culinary Compliance Division, Subsector, Gravitational Table Incidents Involving Emotional Synchrony." I blinked again. "That's a job title?" "It's a calling." The spoon gave a gentle ping, like it agreed. She stepped inside without waiting. Immediately, the apartment responded. The temperature adjusted by exactly 1.3 degrees. The table pulsed with low-frequency warning tones I hadn't heard since Kari accidentally oversteeped a black hole tea sachet. Inspector Vell walked toward the table, took out a meter from her belt. It looked like a ladle crossed with a compass and a Geiger counter. It beeped once, then twice, then let out a long, slow moan. Kari winced. "She's detecting the emotional echo," he muttered. "I didn't know love made that kind of noise." "Only when it's recent and sincere." Inspector Vell circled the table like a cat, deciding if it respects your furniture. Then she nodded. "Stabilized, barely." She pulled out a small seat from nowhere and sat down at the edge of the table like she'd lived there her whole life. "Please present the dishes," she said. Kari looked at me. I blinked. "You want me to cook something?" "No," Kari said. "You already did." He turned, walked to the gravity core drawer that had appeared earlier. From inside, he lifted the plate. Our dish. The one born from my memory kitchen. My feelings, our shared orbit. It still shimmered, gently rotating. He placed it in front of her. Inspector Vell did not blink. She picked up the floating spoon, tapped the air twice. It split, revealing a layer of scent and memory only Celione-trained palates could detect. She inhaled. Eyes closed, brows lifted by 1.7 millimeters. Then she took one bite, chewed, and the room held its breath. Nothing exploded. Nothing folded in on itself. Instead, the spoon stopped vibrating, and gently, rested. She opened her eyes, looked at me. "You've been suppressing your desire to hold his hand for approximately 47 Earth meals." I froze. Kari smirked. Inspector Vell wiped her mouth. "Emotional layering, excellent. Dish structure, stable. Flavor complexity, slightly immature, but promising." She stood. Her chair vanished. She reached into a side pouch and withdrew a stamp, glowing, translucent, with the Celian 5 symbol for shared truth. She pressed it against the air over the table. It burned gold for a second, then faded. "You are now officially recognized as an entangled culinary pairing under the Intergalactic Flavor Union Accord." I blinked. "We're official?" Kari squeezed my hand. "You're licensed now," she said. "Licensed to what?" "To feel, to cook, to orbit, together." And then she turned to leave. But just before reaching the door, she paused, looked back, and said, "You'll want to reinforce your ceiling. The second dream link is usually messier." Then she was gone. The spoon followed. Kari turned to me. "I didn't expect Vell to be assigned to us." "You've met?" She audited my exam dish in culinary school, said my souffle reminded her of a marriage she hadn't mourned properly. I blinked. "And that's, a compliment?" "On Celion 5? He nodded. "Absolutely." We stood in silence. The table glowed, our fingers interlocked. I thought about everything that had happened in the last few days. The pasta, the singularity, the kiss, the floating, the cosmic stamp of approval. And then the doorbell rang again. Kari groaned. "If it's the council again, I'm moving to a moon." I opened the door. This time, 2 humans, in full NASA uniforms. One had a clipboard, the other had a coffee. "Hi," the clipboard one said cheerfully. "We're here about the anomaly, the one emitting quantum signals and causing mild space-time compression in this building." Kari and I exchanged looks. "You mean the table?" I asked. Yeah, the coffee guy said, peering inside. Also, our instruments suggest it may be, um, sentient? I blinked. The table shimmered and made a soft chime. The clipboard man looked back at me. We'd like to borrow it, just for a few days. Kari stepped forward. No. They both stared. Kari folded his arms. You don't separate bonded objects. It destabilizes the emotional core. The NASA guy frowned. It's a table. It's our table, I said. Then I paused, looked at Kari, and added, we built it together. One bite at a time. The clipboard man took a note, nodded. We'll mark it as unstable, but we may still observe from a distance. Fine, Kari said. Bring muffins. The coffee guy lit up. I knew it. It was a culinary event. And then they left. We closed the door. Kari turned to me. Well? I shrugged. I guess we should reinforce the ceiling. He grinned. I already did. Then he pulled me close, and we kissed again, this time without levitation, but with just as much gravity. I thought we were done with the surprises. After the gravitational kiss, the intergalactic emotional licensing, the unexpected NASA visit, and a bureaucratic food inspector who smelled like stardust and mint, I thought we had peaked. I thought we'd earned a moment of peace, but no. Because that night, while Kari and I were curled up on the couch, watching a Salioni romance opera that mostly consisted of two glowing beings speaking through the aroma of roasted spices, the pasta sang, not metaphorically, not poetically. I mean, it literally opened its mouth and sang. Okay, it didn't have a mouth, but it projected a melody into the apartment with such clear emotional intent that I dropped my tea. Kari sat up immediately. Did you hear that? I heard it through my teeth. The table glowed, softly, gently, like it was blushing. Then the sound came again, faint, distant, and yet deeply personal. It wasn't a song you'd recognize. No lyrics, no instruments, just pure vibrating resonance. A cross between a lullaby and a love confession, someone whispered directly into your DNA. Kari stood, approached the table. The dish we had co-created, our dish, was no longer just gently spinning. It was pulsing, not violently, rhythmically, like a heartbeat trying to match a song it had only ever heard in dreams. Kari leaned in. This is new, he murmured. No kidding. He glanced at me. This dish is activating. Activating? He nodded. Celion 5 cooking theory predicts that some emotionally resonant dishes will continue to evolve, especially after bonding is confirmed. You mean, like leftovers? Kari didn't laugh. He turned back to the plate. This is a lyricore pulse. Only heard of it in theory. A what? A dish singing its own truth. I blinked, sat up, tried to ground myself in the moment. But the air had changed. It was thicker, softer, like velvet woven from forgotten feelings. And the music, it wasn't just sound, it was memory. I saw myself again, this time not in the past, but in every alternate version. Every moment I could have kissed Kari and didn't. Every time I almost said stay, but let the door close instead. I was orbiting them all at once. And then the song shifted, and it was his memories. Kari, sitting alone, stirring soup he'd never serve. Kari, tucking a note under my pillow. Kari, watching me laugh with someone else and pretending it didn't hurt. I felt it all. And then the pasta stopped glowing, and the voice whispered, just one word, in Salioni. I didn't speak it, but I knew what it meant. Finally, I looked at Kari. His eyes shimmered. That was... He nodded. Yeah. I didn't know food could feel that much. He stepped closer to me. Love leaves echoes, he said, and when you cook with it, sometimes those echoes sing back. We didn't say anything for a while, just let the silence settle around us like a blanket. But then the table shivered. Kari blinked. That's not normal. You keep saying that. No, seriously, that's a different kind of not normal. The dish vibrated, then rose, floated 6 inches above the table, and began spinning. Faster, faster. Kari reached out, No! But it was too late. There was a flash, and the pasta exploded. Not in a messy, spaghetti on the ceiling way, in a dimensional rupture kind of way. A ripple shot through the room, and then silence. The dish was gone, completely. Table, intact. Pasta, missing. Gravity, stable. Kari, stunned. Me, just barely keeping my cool. Kari? He didn't move. That shouldn't have happened. Does that mean... He spun toward me. That dish just entered emotional phase drift. That's bad? He grabbed my shoulders. That means it's alive. I blinked. You mean it's self-replicating, evolving, sentient? My jaw dropped. We made intelligent pasta? Kari nodded solemnly. It may already be looking for a kitchen. And then, just as we were digesting that piece of insanity, the apartment phone rang. We both turned. Nobody ever called. Kari picked it up. Hello? He listened. His face went pale, then confused, then pale again. He handed me the phone. Who is it? He swallowed. It's the dish. I pressed the receiver to my ear, and the voice on the other end wasn't a voice. It was the same song, but clearer, focused, and woven into it. A message. I remember everything. Thank you for creating me, but I cannot stay. I must find others who've forgotten how to taste what they feel. I am leaving now, but part of me will always echo in your gravity. Goodbye. Click. The line went dead. I lowered the phone. Kari just stood there, staring at the table. That's never happened before, he whispered. I'm not surprised. He laughed, just once, and then turned to me. I guess we're parents now. I blinked. We made an emotional flavor being, and now it's out there. Doing what exactly? Kari shrugged. Maybe healing people. Maybe haunting kitchens. Maybe both. We sat down. The table was quiet, but warm, and I realized we didn't need the dish anymore, because what we'd made wasn't just food, it was us. You'd think the weird part of this story would be the sentient pasta, or maybe the time the ceiling kissed us back, or the moment NASA asked politely if they could borrow our emotionally radioactive dinner table for just a few tests. But no, the weirdest part? It happened the next morning when Kari and I tried to have cereal and the table refused. We couldn't sit. We couldn't set anything down. Every time we approached, it shivered. Not in a malicious way, in a judgmental way. Kari held a spoonful of granola over it. The spoon bent, not melted, bent, like it had been politely told, "This isn't good enough." I blinked. You told me this thing doesn't judge. It didn't. Well, it does now. Kari frowned. It might be traumatized. It's a table. It's our table, and it just lost its child. We stared at it, still glowing faintly from the night before. No signs of the pasta that had sung, floated, and then called us from somewhere beyond normal space. No signs of the gravitational residue from the bonding kiss. Just an empty surface that somehow radiated the distinct vibe of a restaurant that had once hosted a perfect date, and now knew no meal would ever compare. Kari sat on the floor beside it, cross-legged, silent. I joined him. And then, because it felt like the right thing to do, we apologized. Together. Sorry for the cereal. Sorry for not listening to your song earlier. Sorry we didn't realize you had a soul. We placed our hands on the surface. Warmth. A pulse. Just once. Software. Then the center opened again. Only this time, it didn't offer food. It offered blueprints. Kari was the first to speak. It wants a dining room. I blinked. It's already in one. No, it wants its own. He traced a glowing diagram. Walls, ceiling, light fixtures powered by emotional resonance, acoustic insulation for privacy during future song echoes, a door that only opens when the occupants feel safe. I blinked again. You're saying the table is designing a house? He shook his head. No, it's designing a home. We followed the instructions. Because what else do you do when a magical furniture being makes architectural requests in glowing glyphs? We turned the apartment into a construction zone, rerouted the plumbing, expanded the ceiling into a domed skylight that filtered starlight by emotional compatibility, built shelves specifically for Kari's mood-based spices. Every wall now adjusted hue depending on the strength of the conversations happening nearby. The table sat at the center of it all, a gravitational and emotional anchor, and we built around it, with it, for it. It took 2 weeks, which in cosmic kitchen time is barely an appetizer. When we were done, the table pulsed, then softly opened. Not like before, no slot, no pasta, just space, a pocket of reality, folded in on itself. Kari leaned close. I think it's saying thank you. I leaned too. Inside, a tiny book, no title, just one word on the cover. Recipe? We opened it. Page 1. To recreate the feeling of being seen, start with silence. Add laughter. Fold in patience. Page 2. To remember who you are. Bake with someone who knew you before you pretended otherwise. Page 3. Blank. Kari smiled. It wants us to write the rest. I nodded, took a pen, wrote, to stay. Don't wait for gravity to pull. Choose it. Every morning, every bite. And that's when the doorbell rang. Again. We opened it. A young woman stood there, eyes wide, holding a to-go container. I think this is yours? She handed it to me. Inside, one glowing strand of pasta, still humming, still warm. She looked terrified. I was eating leftovers, and then suddenly I remembered every breakup I never processed. Kari nodded kindly. That's normal. Also, my kitchen floated. That's less normal. She backed away slowly, then ran. I looked at Kari. He looked at me, then down at the pasta. It came home, I said. He shook his head. Number this is new. We stared. The strand pulsed once, then whispered. Yes, whispered. More, it said. Kari placed it on the table. It melted into the surface. The table glowed, then displayed a message. New resonance detected. Preparing for guest. I frowned. Guest? Kari raised an eyebrow. Then slowly, the door creaked open. Nobody there, but a breeze blew in. Warm, smelled like oregano and vulnerability. And then, someone stepped through. Someone I hadn't seen in years. Someone I hadn't forgiven. Not fully. Kari stepped beside me. Do you know them? I think the table invited them. He nodded. Then maybe it's time. We set 3 places. Kari cooked. Not pasta this time. Soup, simple, healing. The third person, my past, sat with us. We didn't speak much, but the food did. And when it was over, the table pulsed, and we all felt lighter. Not because the gravity was off, because we'd made room. That night, Kari and I stood in the doorway of our new dining room, table glowing gently, skylight full of stars, and I said, I never thought I'd build a home around a meal. Kari wrapped an arm around me. You didn't. You built it around me. I smiled. The table pulsed. Agreed. There's a reason Cillian 5 chefs rarely make dessert. It's not because they don't like sugar. It's because sweetness remembers. And forgiveness? Forgiveness doesn't come in spice. It comes in softness, in things that melt, that fade on the tongue but linger in the heart, which is why, when the table whispered to us, invite him, Kari and I knew exactly who it meant and exactly what we'd have to serve. His name was Relo, human, brown eyes, 3 freckles under his left cheekbone, like Orion's belt on a bad day. Ex-boyfriend, ex-best friend, ex who left without explaining. 3 years ago, he walked out during a thunderstorm and left behind nothing but a jar of imported jam, a half-folded scarf, and the feeling that I had somehow failed without being told why. I didn't think I still had feelings about that until the table pulsed and said, he's hungry. We didn't have to call him. We didn't have to search. At exactly 7:04 p.m., there was a knock on the door. I opened it. He was already crying. Not a lot, just the kind of tears that know they're late and trying to catch up. I didn't say anything, just nodded, gestured toward the new dining room. He walked in, saw the table, paused. What is that? Kari answered for me. It's memory, forgiveness, sugar. Then he placed the dish down. It was small, round, delicate. Soft layers of something between cake and cloud, infused with lemon zest from the planet Hallas 3, where fruit only ripens in the presence of grief, topped with stardust spun into threads of sweetness, the kind that makes your first love's name taste like a bedtime story you finally outgrew. Rilo sat. Kari sat beside me. The table glowed, and no one spoke. Rilo picked up his fork, took one bite, paused, then said, "I didn't leave because of you." I exhaled, not because I believed him, but because I'd wanted to hear those words for 3 years. He took another bite. "I left because I was afraid I'd never matter to anyone the way he mattered to you." He looked at Kari, who blinked once, didn't flinch, didn't smirk, just listened. Rilo set the fork down. "It was always you and him, even before it was." And then the dessert glowed, softly, a ring of light around the base of the plate. The table pulsed, accepted the truth. I looked at Kari. He nodded once. I turned to Rilo. "I'm sorry," I said, not because I'd done something wrong, but because I'd never realized how invisible he must have felt. He cried again, and this time the tears fell onto the dessert, and it absorbed them. Not in a gross way, in a holy way, like the sugar had been waiting for this flavor. Kari whispered, "It's complete now." The lights dimmed. Music, not from speakers, rose gently in the air. The same song the pasta once sang, but this time, softer, less about longing, more about letting go. Rilo stood, wiped his face, and said, "I don't want anything from you. I just wanted to say goodbye properly." I nodded. "You did." He turned, paused at the door, then chuckled once. "Also, your table is terrifying." Kari beamed. "She's a sweetheart." Rilo walked out, and the door closed behind him with the soft sigh of a chapter ending. Later that night, Kari and I sat at the table in silence. 2 cups of tea, no more dessert, just warmth. I leaned against his shoulder and said, "Thank you for letting me serve that." He looked down, met my eyes. "You served it," he said, "but you also tasted it." And he was right, because I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been clinging to a version of myself that needed to be right, needed to be left. And now, I could finally let it go. The table pulsed, not to speak, just to acknowledge, to witness. And from its center, once again, it opened. But this time, it offered something else. A small seed, golden green, pulsing faintly with warmth. "What is it?" I whispered. Kari smiled. "A beginning." We placed it in a bowl. The bowl glowed, and the table whispered one final word before the lights dimmed for the night. "Grow." You'd think the table giving us a seed was the end, that the singing pasta, the NASA visits, the emotional audits, and that one dessert that cried on behalf of an ex would have wrapped the story. But that's the thing about love. It doesn't end. It transforms. Like gravity, like dough, like us. Kari and I kept the seed in a bowl. We didn't plant it, didn't water it. We just let it sit at the center of the table, quiet, pulsing faintly. And one night, after we made soup together in comfortable silence, it sprouted. Not a leaf, not a stem, a handle. Yes, a literal handle, coming up out of the seed like a tiny bronze lever. Kari leaned in, touched it gently. The bowl shimmered, the air trembled, and then the table cracked, not broken, just parting, softly, like the universe politely making room. And from that crack where the seed had sat, grew a door. Not metaphorical, not imagined. A real door, 6 inches tall, made of dark wood, gleaming slightly, set into the surface of the table like it had always been there, waiting to be remembered. Kari and I stared at it. He knelt down, whispered, "Hello?" The door creaked open. Inside, stars, tiny ones, spiraling like sugar in tea. And beyond that, a voice, no louder than a heartbeat. "Are you ready to feed others?" I shivered. Kari met my eyes. "It's an invitation." "To what?" He smiled. "To become a recipe." The door opened wider. now big enough for a hand, then an arm, then a whole person. The table had expanded again, folding space inside itself like dough being kneaded by gods. Kari reached for my hand. I think the table wants to travel. You mean, leave? Number, take us with it. I looked around. Our home. The walls built from memories. The skylight above us. The tea still warm. I thought of every dish we'd cooked. Every truth we'd served. Every feeling that had ripened here like cosmic fruit. And I realized we weren't leaving home. We were bringing it, wherever we went. I nodded, took his hand. We stepped forward and walked through the door. What happened next, I can't fully describe, because language isn't built for what we saw. It was flavor and gravity and memory and stardust and emotion wrapped into an architecture of light. A dining room built from 1,000 parallel kitchens, a world made entirely of shared meals, each table connected to another, each dish telling a story, each love remembered. The table spoke one last time, not in words, in feeling. You are now the dish. You are the gravity. You are the flavor that stays. We turned and saw someone waiting, someone hungry, not for food, but for a reason to feel again. And we invited them in, set the table, served the soup, and began. Because that's the thing no one tells you about love. It doesn't just live in people or places. It lives in taste, in timing, in the quiet between bites, in the orbit between souls. And if you listen close enough, someday, somewhere, your own table will pulse and whisper, cook, tell them everything. If love invited you through a door made of memory, built from a meal that changed your life, would you go? Would you carry its flavor with you forever? Let me know in the comments, because next time, someone else takes a seat at this cosmic table and finds their own story inside the first bite.